Welcome to Lecture 6 of Institutions of the European Union. My name is Rick-Jan Brinkman. Together with my colleague Maarten van Münster, I teach this course. Maarten gave you the audio and the presentation for last week online, and I will do this week. Most of the students know me, but for those who don't know me, who were in Maarten's class, I'm a European Studies lecturer, I'm a political scientist, and I will also hopefully teach you next year European public policy. This week we are going to talk about the other EU bodies and specialized agencies. For example, about the European Central Bank or about Europol. And this week fits in the course. We started in week 1 with the history of the European Union. Then we talked about the three institutions in the triangle. So we talked about the European Commission in week 2, the Council in week 3, and the Parliament in week 4. And last week, Mr. van Münster discussed the Court of Justice with you. So this week we basically wrap up the course. We're talking about important institutions. However, these institutions are not of key importance in the triangle, which we have discussed so often this course. So, what is today on the menu, so to say? First, we are going to talk about the European Central Bank. And after that, we will talk about decentralized and executive agencies. I will explain later what this exactly entails. Then we will also talk about the European Court of Auditors, those who basically look at the budget. We will also have a short look at some of the advisory bodies to the European Union. And last but not least, I will also give you a bit of exam prep. Okay, now the European Central Bank. It is important to remember from the first week that it has always been the idea of the European Union that countries would integrate and cooperate politically because of economic integration first. And that's why the single market is by far the most important policy of the European Union. And it's impossible to be a member of the European Union and not accept the single market. The Brexit is a very good example of that, because the British were not willing to accept the free movement of persons anymore, which is a key part of the single market, and this meant that they had to leave. Now, the euro has a similar idea because it's also an economic project, it's a monetary project. So here again, the idea is that if we start to cooperate on a monetary basis, then this would lead to further European integration. However, there is a very important difference. Even though you need to accept the single market completely to the EU when you want to become a member of the EU, it is possible to be a member of the EU and not have the euro. Think, for example, of Sweden and Denmark, who don't have the euro but are members of the EU. And therefore, the institutions which are ruling the euro are actually institutions which do not deal with all member states. And for example, the central bank takes over, this European Central Bank takes over the monetary policy of all member states of the euro, but not all member states of the European Union. Now, originally it was the idea that step by step all EU member states would implement the euro. However, after the euro crisis, this has become very difficult because some of the member states, especially the southern member states, think of Greece, but also maybe of Portugal, have had problems during the economic crisis, and part of that problem was that they did not have their own monetary policy because this was centrally done in Frankfurt, where the central bank is. And some of member states have seen that and thought like, maybe it's not a good idea for us to join the euro quickly. So therefore, we will have, when it comes to the euro, a Europe at two speeds. Some member states are part of the euro and are also ruled by the central bank, and other member states still have their own national currency. The European Central Bank was established in 1998, 3 years before the introduction of the euro, and it is still located in Frankfurt in Germany. What is important to know is that the central bank works independently from both national governments, but also from the Council and the European Commission. I will explain the roles of the central bank in a bit, but what is important to know is that the central bank is autonomous, so it can execute those roles and its policy goals autonomously, and it cannot be pressured by any government. At the moment, the president of the central bank is the former IMF director and former French minister Christine Lagarde. She is the first woman to hold this post. And she has an important role because she leads the most important meetings of the central bank, where also national bank directors come together, and she therefore manages also the most important policy goals of the bank. Now, what can the central bank do? First and foremost, it manages the euro and monetary policy. And its prime goal is to ensure price stability, which means that the goal of the bank is that the Eurozone should have a very low inflation. For example, at the moment, in the past years, the inflation has been between 1 and about 3%. That means that our coin loses over a year about that value, and that's seen as a very low inflation. To control the inflation, the most important tool the bank has is to control the money supply and decide interest rates. The money supply means, very simply said, that the bank can decide how much money is printed. And the interest rates are set by the bank as well. As you maybe know, at the moment, interest rates are really, really low, which means that it is not a good thing to save, and that it's very cheap to lend. And the idea then is that this should stimulate the economy, because if it's a very stupid idea to save money and very cheap to lend money, you can understand that it's the best thing to just let the money roll and invest money. And that's the current policy of the bank. Next to that, the bank can also keep an eye on national budget and supervise the Eurozone's largest bank. These powers actually only came after the euro crisis because so many countries had sovereign debt problems, so they basically had a very high debt, and this of course was due to budget deficits, and next to that some of the Eurozone banks went bankrupt. And the control by the European Central Bank should make sure that they cannot go bankrupt again. And this week, the European Central Bank has been in the news because they actually are also trying to stop an economic crisis from happening because of the current COVID-19 or Corona crisis. What did they do? They basically decided to create a 750 billion euro program to make it possible for the European Central Bank to bail out the debts both of large companies, think for example of airlines, which can get into trouble because of the current situation, but also of states which have a very high debt. You can, for example, think of Italy. As you know, Italy has been hit severely by the Corona crisis. And of course, this means a big blow for the Italian economy, but also an increase in healthcare costs. And the European Central Bank can help with that in the sense that they not directly finance the Italian state, but that they could buy debt from the Italian state, which makes it possible for Italy to keep on lending on international markets. And the main goal of this is that there is a fear that the euro crisis, which happened in 2008, could possibly repeat itself because of the economic slump, which is probably going to happen after this Corona crisis or already during the crisis. And to make sure that doesn't happen, they basically want to create a preemptive program to stop companies and states from bankruptcy. So actually, at this point, we are going from institutions which have a very important macro role, which means that they coordinate very important things in the entire union, to institutions or agencies which have actually more a micro role. What I mean to say with this difference is that the institution which we discussed so far, like the Commission, like the Parliament, and like the Council, they had a very important role in taking decisions on the European level, in implementing laws, and so on. And if we look, for example, at the Court of Justice, they are very important, not only because you can basically go to them and see whether your rights have not been violated, but they also are the guardians of the treaties, which are like the constitutions for the European Union. And also the European Central Bank, even though it does not make the policy, the monetary policy for the entire European Union, because not all member states of the European Union do have the euro. They actually are really important because they set the monetary policy for so many countries in the European Union. And as we have just seen in the example of the corona crisis, we see that they actually are very powerful and can take very important big decisions where billions of euros are involved. The institutions, or so the agencies which we're going to discuss now, actually are micro agencies. What do I mean with that? I mean to say with that they basically manage on one particular issue the information, or they make sure that they have the legal aspects straight of certain aspects. So they are actually responsible for small parts of EU policy. Now, let's start with decentralized agencies. These agencies are permanent. That means that they are not temporary, so they don't stop after a while. They are there for life, so to say. They are paid from the EU budget, and their responsibility is to do some technical management or to give information to the EU. And they actually can be quite powerful. For example, you have the European Chemicals Agency, and they can take legally binding decisions, which means that if this agency decides that a chemical, for example, has to be banned, that this is binding. Another example is the European Food and Safety Authority, and they gave scientific and technical advice concerning food safety. Maybe you have heard about the example of the chlorine chicken. It would be an example for the EFSA. Is it safe to eat chicken which is washed in chlorine? I don't know, to be honest, but they probably have an answer. Then we move on to another example which is more operational. An example there is the European Global Navigation Satellite System agencies. And they basically make sure that they have information for satellite system presence, so which is also important. And then we also have the European Environment Agency, and they collect basically information on how the European environment is doing, and they write reports about that. Now, next to the agencies mentioned before, we also have executive agencies. Executive agencies are a little bit different because they are not permanent, so they are not there forever. They are just there for a couple of years, sometimes maybe a decade, and they have a very specific task. They are based in Brussels, and they answer directly to the Directorate Generals of the European Commission. Maybe you remember this from week 2. The Directorate Generals are, for the Commission, what ministries are on the national level. And here you have some examples. Let me pick out one. The European Research Council, for example, can give funding for research generally, I think, on the academic level in Europe. So that's just one example. They have to make sure that research money goes to the right places. Now, what is important to know is that The permanent agencies are spread all over the European Union. And actually, this is a way also for the European Union to make sure that there is a certain spread of employment, for example, by spreading those agencies. Yeah. Because for an agency, generally quite some people work. It depends on the agency, of course, how many people work there. But these are well-paid jobs, and very often the agencies also bring some employment because they need supplies, for example. Yeah, and of course, if an agency is located in, let's say, Budapest in Hungary or in Prague in the Czech Republic, that means that also local companies and local businesses profit from having that agency there, because they will have to make sure that, for example, just a very small example, office supplies are present. And on the map here you can see that there is almost a perfect spread. Almost all member states have one or more agencies, and generally this is also a bit of politics involved. If a member state feels that they have too little agencies, or that the agencies which they host are not very big, that they generally try to get an agency as soon as a new agency has been founded. Now, in The Hague there are actually also two agencies. Maybe you know that The Hague likes to see itself or portrays itself as the law capital, so to say, of the world, because also the Peace Palace is located in The Hague. And so it's a bit of the judicial capital of the world, maybe in that sense. And actually the two European agencies, the EU agencies, which are located in The Hague, also deal with questions of crime and justice, namely Europol and Eurojust. Yeah, Europol came in 1999 to The Hague. It is a criminal intelligence organization, a bit comparable to the CIA in the United States of America. However, they are a bit less powerful. Yeah, but what they really try to do is they try to set up a system of information exchange between police forces in Europe. Yeah. Then we also have Eurojust. Eurojust 2002. And it is a judicial cooperation unit, which means that what they try to do, they try to make sure that prosecutors, for example, in different European member states can cooperate together. Yeah, and one way to do so is to create joint investigation teams in which prosecutors of several European countries can come together to try to make sure that criminal cases are solved and that the criminals especially are brought to justice. And here you can read, if you go to the link, you can read an example of a successful Europol investigation. And what should be stressed especially is here that it's really about the cooperation between the national police and Europol. And in this case, there is a focus on dealing also with cybercrime by infiltrating websites. But what they really try to do is to make sure that national police forces can do their work better, and also that they can cooperate more efficiently. Okay, now we move on to the European Court of Auditors. And as you probably know, an auditor is somebody who checks the books. So who basically looks after the project is over, how effective the project was, how money has been spent. This is very common for any company or any educational institution to have auditors and to have an audit every year of the funds, and sometimes over a longer term for a longer project, also an evaluation for example, over 5 years how money has been spent. Well, that's exactly what the Court of Auditors does, but then on the EU level. So the Court of Auditors is the EU's financial watchdog, and as I said, they check that funds, EU funds, are used properly. They have 27 members. Each member state has one member. However, what is important to remember is that all these members are independent, so they are nominated by their member states. But as soon as they are a member of the European Court of Auditors, they are seen as independent, so they cannot take instructions, for example, from their member state. The idea, of course, is that they should be independent because they need to check funds and whether funds are properly spent. And if they get instructions and become very political, then they might willingly oversee failures by one of the member states, and that has to be avoided. Now, their head office is in Luxembourg. And the principle is that they can choose which person or organizations which deals with EU funds or receives EU subsidies can be checked up on how they use it. Yeah. However, they do not have judicial powers, which means that they can, for example, not persecute people. They can report on people. And this, of course, can always lead later by other institutions to persecution, or this report can be used for that. But they cannot do that themselves. Okay, so now it's time to get a little teardrop in your eye, because we are moving for this course to the last new institutions, or the last new, in this case, the advisory bodies. And after that, no new information anymore. And these are the European Economic and Social Committee and the European Committee of the Regions. Now, the way you should understand those advisory bodies is that the EU is a very big international organization, and therefore it can live quite far apart from what everyday citizens want. These two advisory bodies are a way to bridge that gap, so to say, because what we will see here is that in the Committee of the Regions, local governments are represented, for example, which of course local governments are very close to the day-to-day life of ordinary European citizens. And in the Economic and Social Committee, important trade unions or civil or employers unions are, for example, represented. Yeah, so these are the people who represent the interests of workers and of employers, for example. So that's a way for the EU to get advice from people who are closer to everyday European citizens. So here we have the European Economic and Social Committee, with the goal to involve civil society in EU matters. As I said, they represent trade unions. Sometimes we also call trade unions workers' unions. They represent employers, farmers, but also consumers, for example. And they gave advice to the European Committee, the Parliament, and the Council on any issue which deals with social rights, social policy, or consumer protection, for example. And then we also have the Committee of the Regions. As I said in the last slide, it promotes the involvement of local government in EU matters. So they represent cities or regions. In the Netherlands, you can think of the provinces or of the city councils or of mayors. And they advise on laws dealing with the economy and also social cohesion. Actually, cohesion funds are a big chunk of the EU budget, which goes generally to underdeveloped regions. And they also deal with trans-European networks, which means how is Europe connected? Yeah, so how are cities connected with each other, for example. So these are two examples of advisory committees, advisory bodies to the European Union. Okay, now we are coming to the conclusion for today. However, please hang in there, because after the conclusion, I still want to say something about the exam. Let's start for the conclusion with the European Central Bank and the Court of Auditors. They complete a list of the 7 main EU institutions in the sense that they deal with, on the macro level, with EU policy. They have a direct influence on EU policy making. The European Central Bank actually has policy power itself. It can propose new policies, and the Court of Auditors evaluate how other institutions on the macro EU level, on the highest EU level, implement EU policies, and they can write reports about that. Yeah. Concerning the ECB, it's important to know that its power has grown in response to the final financial crisis in 2008, and now with the current crisis which is going on, the 2020 Corona crisis. I'm afraid we already can call it that. They have also given quite a bold response in which they have decided to get 750 billions of euro funding to bail out possible debts of companies and states. The Court of Auditors then is critical to investigate fraud and mismanagement. You know? Next to those two institutions, we also had a look at EU agencies and advisory bodies. Yeah, and the agencies basically provide specialist, technical, and scientific information to support the work of the EU in various fields, and sometimes they take technical decisions as well. We have seen the example of the chemical agencies, which can decide whether certain chemicals are allowed or not. And then lastly, we have seen the advisory bodies, which basically represent groups in the European society to make sure that there is a connection between the EU and its citizens. Okay, now we move on to the exam preparation. And of course, I need to talk with you about the slide of all slides for this course, namely the institutional triangle of the European Union. And just to refresh this information for you, we see three institutions inside the triangle, but we see also one very important institution outside, the European Council. And as has been stressed several times before, the European Council, even though it's outside the official triangle and it cannot, for example, propose new legislation, it is really important because here the real power holders of the EU are gathering 4 times a year in Brussels. They are headed by the EU president, the president of the Council, Charles Michel, and, for example, the German Chancellor, the Dutch Prime Minister, the French President, they all meet there, the heads of states and governments. And of course, because they are so powerful, even though their decisions are not officially and formal, they have a huge impact on the long-term strategy of the European Union. Then we move on to the Commission. As we discussed, the Commission is the most important executive part of the EU. So basically, the commissioners lead, the 27 commissioners lead 27 directorates generals, and these directorate generals are actually comparable to ministries on the national level. And next to that, there is the president, Ursula von der Leyen. And she is also particularly important because she is for many people also the face of the European Union. Now, even though the European Commission mostly is focused on the executive, so on making sure that all the decisions taken by the EU are implemented properly, they also have a legislative function. Namely, they are the only one in the European system who can make proposals for new legislation. And then we come to the two last institutions in this particular triangle, namely the European Parliament and the Council of Ministers, because they co-decide on these proposals made by the European Commission. And let's start with the Council of Ministers. So they are meeting in 10 configurations. These are national ministers. And depending on the topic of which is debated by the council, sometimes the agricultural minister goes, sometimes the education minister, sometimes the foreign minister, and so on. What's important to remember is that the council has a rotating presidency. So every 6 months, a different country is presiding over the council. Yeah, the minister of that particular country, which is presiding over the council, then presides over the meeting of the Council of Ministers. Then lastly, what is also important to remember of the council is qualified majority voting. In the council, not every minister's vote counts as much as any other ministers vote. It depends on the size of the country and also the population of the country. And they made a special formula for that. And in that sense, it's possible for the council to take decisions against the will of some of its members, which is very special because all these ministers are members of sovereign governments. Yeah, at home they are the ones to decide things, and here in Europe they sometimes have to accept that they are overruled by a majority of other ministers. Yeah, and that's sometimes seen as a supranational aspect of the Council of Ministers, in the sense that the council can take decisions against the will of some of the national ministers or the states ministers. But normally the council is clearly seen as a forum for intergovernmental cooperation, because here is where the different governments of the EU meet to co-decide on new legislation. Then, lastly, we go to the European Parliament. Mr. Sassoli is the president of the European Parliament. In total, there are at the moment 704 MEPs. However, that is because one Spanish MEP did not take up its seat. Normally, it should be 705. They work in many ways as a national parliament. They have different committees to talk about certain topics, and they can also vote on proposals made by the European Commission. Normally in the European Parliament, a normal majority is enough to accept the proposal by the European Committee and we have the European Commission, so to accept the proposal by the European Commission. And then we have seen that in the European Parliament there are different political groups, and they consist of national parties. So we vote for national parties and we send them to Europe, and there they try to get together in groups. For example, German Social Democrats join Dutch Social Democrats and French Social Democrats in the Socialist group. And you have the EPP, the European People's Party, the biggest party in the parliament, which consists mostly of Christian Democrats from Germany, for example, and the Netherlands, and conservatives from, for example, Spain. So that's the European Parliament. It's just very, very important that you know this slide by heart, that you know the people who are on there, that you understand which functions the different institutions here have and how they relate to each other, and that you understand the difference between being inside the triangle and being outside the triangle. That is really important and can get you quite some points on the upcoming exam. Now, some practical information about the exam. There are 40 multiple choice questions, and you have 90 minutes to write your exam. You get for each of the questions 4 options, and one of them is correct. A 5.5 is enough to pass. And how to prepare for the exam. Read the mandatory literature, the chapters from McCormick's book. However, what is important is that sometimes McCormick is rather detailed. So take the slides as your guidance. Take the slides and check whether you can find some extra information or some extra explanation from McCormick. But take the slides really as the most important source for learning the exams. Now, you could, for example, make flashcards, and of course, very important that you make a flashcard for each of the main institutions, that you see what it does, what its role is in, for example, the triangle. Next to that, other topics are the treaties, enlargements, decision-making within the European Union, and legal acts. And of course, then there is also the point of the most important people. We will ask you about some key people. Think of the Commission President, think of the President of the Parliament, think of the President of the Council. Now, of course, I won't promise you that all these people will get into the exam, but 1 or 2 you can certainly expect. And now actually it also crosses my mind that you might want to check who is the High Representative for Foreign Affairs. I can give you that. That's Mr. Borrell. Okay, that's what you can do for the exam. Next to that, it is possible from the coming week on, we will also make an announcement on Blackboard to ask questions about the exam online. Please send those questions to me, to Mr. Brinkman. I will answer your questions, and I will also make a document with most frequently asked questions, so that if you missed out on an opportunity to ask questions the coming week, you can still have a look at the overview of different questions which have been asked by your fellow students. Okay, so now we are at the final slide. Thank you very much for your attention. It was a pleasure to teach you this course. We wish you good luck with preparing for the exam. In case you have any questions, please contact us. And next to that, in these days, it's especially important that you stay healthy. So please take good care of yourself, and all the luck with preparing for the exam.